Fangping, Moonlit Night. Late at night, the moon floods light on half of my house. The north dippers high above, the south dipper sinks from sight. Tonight, I feel the warmth of spring begin to stir, as insects whisper through green window shades. So, we continue with the quatrains. In this case, we have the first of a pair of poems written by the same poet, Liu Fangping. And these two are the only two of his that belong to the collection. I must confess, I had never heard of this poet, but the biographical note at the end of this book gives us some information about him. And it says that he was a native of Luoyang, the eastern capital, and that he came from a long line of civil servants. His father was an investigation commissioner in the south, and Liu Fangping grew up in a wealthy household as a consequence. He failed the examination, the Jinshi examination, in 750, and he served for a while in military headquarters, but was keenly disappointed at his examination failure and soon resigned. He lived the rest of his life as a recluse in the mountainous area of the Ru and Jing rivers, in what is now northern Anhui, basically in the center east of the country. He was a good friend of other poets like Zhuang Jie, Huang Furan, and Li Qi. 26 poems of his have survived, including the two we will be reading today and tomorrow. So from his dates, he does feel like a high Tang poet, or just immediately before the Dali era poets as well. Okay, it's probably not out of place in the line of poems following Han Hong. So he would have been a late Hai Tang or a Dali era poet. And let's go on to commenting this poem in particular. Moonlit Night. Now, the moon is a very common poetic image in classical Chinese poetry. I would say in universal poetry, but quite can't think right now of Nawal poems about the moon. It's very typical in Eastern poetry, especially. So you find the moon. In fact, it's such a common trope, such a common image that it becomes trite and conventional in both classical Chinese and Japanese poetry. The moon is associated with beauty. It's associated with sadness, with melancholy. It's associated with love, with separation, because different people might be seeing at the moon from different places and thinking of each other. There are some legends about creatures and people living in the moon. And generally poems about the moon, not always, but they tend to focus on autumn generally, because it is conventionally believed that the autumn moons are the most beautiful moons of the year. So here we have a poem about, the title says it quite explicitly, a moonlit night. So we would expect from the title a poem describing a delightful night with the moon shining at its fullest and illuminating everything with its pale, frosty light. Actually, the poem surprises us a little bit, because it's not autumn that the poem is talking about, it's spring. In fact, the end of winter and the beginning of spring. So the poem basically describes a poetic persona who is awake at night and late at night. That person is in his own home. He's looking out and sees the moon. The moon is only lighting half of his house, which is a bit ambiguous. Why half and not the whole house? Maybe the moon is still partially covered by clouds or something of the sort. And we will explain this when we talk about the couplets. But the second couplet moves us from this background image of the moon in the sky and the stars to the earthly realm and to the beginning of spring, which is heralded not by the moon, not by the stars, although it could be, but by the slight warmth of the air and the sound of the insects. Now remember, classical Chinese poetry has this special attitude towards nature. Nature is never just a background. As part of a whole set of beliefs of a correlative thought that develop in Chinese philosophy and religion if not earlier, at least from the Warring States period, there's this belief in the interrelationship of the cosmos, of the macrocosm, of the heavens, of nature, with the microcosm of humanity, and not just humanity as a whole, but individuals. So there's this connection, there's interrelation between man and nature. And just as nature has its cycles, man has his own cycles in a way, and can harmonize with the laws and the cycles of nature or not. But a lot of Chinese poems are about this, about men harmonizing with nature, or on the contrary, disharmony that is brought about between men and nature in feelings. And then we have an antithetical contrast, but it's still a significant correlation. So in this poem, you could say the focus is on how spring comes about, how spring is born, and it comes tentatively through indirect signs in nature. So we have the sounds of the animals, and we have the slight warmth in the air, and probably you could say there's probably a change in the mentality of people. So the environment changes, nature changes, animals change, humans also change as well. Okay, so let's take a look at the poem. First couplet says, "Late at night, the moon floods light on half my house. The north dippers high above, the south dipper sinks from sight." So as usual, the first couplet is more like descriptive, and it's more like expansive. It sets the background, and here the background is basically celestial. In the first poem, we have, well, first we have the time. Remember, the chronotope is usually very well developed in the first couplet. So it's night. Not only night, it's late at night. And I have the moon and the house in the first line. The moon is flooding light, only covering or only flooding half of the house. Maybe the half of the house that has windows. Maybe the half of the house that is located, I don't know, maybe in the higher level. Maybe just the moon is only partially visible, so only half of its light is flooding the house. But it's the heavenly relation, the light from the moon coming down. The second line continues with the celestial images. In this case, two asterisms, the North Dipper and the South Dipper, at opposite ends and doing opposite things. I don't know much about Chinese constellations. They were different from our Western ones, but yeah, Northern Dipper would be probably a constellation, maybe related to our own Dipper, the Ursa Major. South Dipper is sinking from sight below the horizon. The moon, the heavens seem to move as the night progresses, and the fixed stars circle with the heavens. So we have these images of the heavens, of the sky, of the moonlight, of the stars in the background. This is interesting because the second couplet brings us down to earth again. And not only to earth, because we had a house reference in the first line, but more subjectively to the poetic persona. And as sometimes happens, the change in the second couplet also goes towards the subjectivity, because we get the feelings of the poetic persona. And his feelings are about the imminent coming of spring, which he or she is feeling in this wakeful night. Tonight, I feel the warmth of spring begin to stir, as insects whisper through green window shades. So the poetic persona, who is awake, we don't know why. Maybe he just wants to enjoy the moon, or there are other reasons that are not explicitly stated in the poem. Well, they're meant to be suggestive for the reader, perhaps. But that poetic persona experiences, there is a change in the third line, which is what is generally appreciated in good quatrains, a change in direction, which goes into the subjective and into the seasonal change that is not prelude by the first couplet. Like tonight, this is a special night, not because this is, like an autumn moon or for any other reasons, but I feel in my bones, as it were, that this night spring is finally coming. Maybe in the calendar spring hasn't come yet, or it has, but it is now in this particular night that the poet, or the poetic persona rather, feels spring is coming in. And he feels it because of the air. Again, the convention is that with spring come warmer winds from the east, which is the direction of spring, and they bring about the rebirth of grasses and flowers and leaves. He seems to be feeling it in this not too chilly night. And as if an echo or as a background chorus to this perception of the poetic persona that spring is coming, the animals seem to feel it as well. Insects whisper through green window shades. Now, the insects are not just a chorus. Each cycle of the seasons brings about changes in the animal world as well, and also would cause some animals to start making sounds because they would be starting courtship, because spring is the universal season of courtship. And the poem ends on that note. So, the birth of spring. It's the birth of spring. It's not a bad poem. Not a bad poem. Maybe a bit too brief, like a quatrain is, and it doesn't really develop much of the background. So you just have this image of in night, the wakeful poet feels in his bones and in his ears and in his skin the coming of spring.